moving on from all the UPI transactions and the Aadhaar technologies being spoken of in India to taking the stage to a more international level, I would now like to request Ambassador Sujan Chinoy, Chair T20 and DG MP-IDSA, to kindly share his thoughts on reformed multilateralism, transforming global institutions and frameworks. Over to you, sir.
Namaskar. Good afternoon to all of you. Very happy to be back at Gujarat University. But let me begin by firstly thanking Professor Himanshu Pandya, the Vice Chancellor of Gujarat University, for agreeing to my proposal to organize a joint event, a tandem between the Manohar Parrikar Institute for Defence Studies and Analysis and Gujarat University, and to invite others as well to join, to work with us for this event. For that, I thank my good friend, Mr. Devyesh Radia, the President of the Ahmedabad Management Association. And since we took very seriously this whole idea of Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam, we also invited the ORF to join us. For that, I thank Mr. Anirban Sarma, who's flown in all the way from Kolkata. And you represent the future of India, the youth. Large numbers that I see before us. So we obviously wanted Y20 also with us. That's Mr. Varun Javeri, who represents the Y20 today. But ladies and gentlemen, I stand before you not only as the DG of the Manohar Parrikar Institute for Defence Studies and Analyses, but also as the Think 20 Chair for India's G20 presidency. But more than that, I stand before you as an alumnus of this great university, Gujarat University. Many years ago, decades ago, in the late 70s, I came here in search of knowledge. I wanted to grow. I wanted to evolve. I wanted to prepare for the civil services. And I couldn't find a better place than Gujarat University. And knowledge is very important. If I look back in time and try and identify a place and a point of time in my life, I am drawn back to those 2 years from 1978 to 1980, when I walked in the same corridors as you do now, in search of knowledge. There is an ancient Sanskrit saying, Sahitya Sangeet Kala Vihin Sakshat Pashupuchya Vishanahin. When I came here in search of knowledge, I was not such a mature person. I was a very youthful person. And my journey towards that knowledge was in part completed by this great institution. For a man without knowledge, for a human being without knowledge, is virtually as unnatural as an animal is without a tail and horns. So it is the natural state of a human being to seek knowledge. For we are perhaps the only life form on earth that has been given this blessing to think beyond our own needs, to think about others. And that is also how India thinks when it speaks of Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam. But before I begin my address, let me tell you how important the G20 is to India, to this region, to our 1.4 billion people, and to the world. It is for the first time that India has taken on the presidency of the G20. It is also the very first time that 4 developing countries are the president of the G20 back to back, beginning with Indonesia last year, India this year, we have Brazil next year, and South Africa the year after. And it's also the very first time for any G20 event anywhere in the world for it to be a people's event. 1.4 billion people are now looking at the G20 with great expectation. They are being told about the G20. It's a mass movement. Where have you seen this in the rest of the world? Nowhere. For that we must thank the Prime Minister of India, Shri Narendra Modi, for actually making it possible to involve the people of India. And that is why we are here, this outreach event, to involve you, to involve every member of the community, the youth across India. There is a Sanskrit saying, Yatha ekena chakrena na rathasya gatir bhavat. Evam purush karena vina daivam na siddhyate. So what does that mean? Yatha ekena chakrena na rathasya gatir bhavat. Just as a chariot cannot move on one wheel, so also without effort, without joint effort, we cannot achieve our potential, our destiny. Yatha ekena chakrena rathasya gatir bhavat. Evam purush karen binadaivam na siddhyate. It is also the first time that 11 engagement groups have been appointed, have been formed to implement the G20. It's also for the first time in the history of the G20 that there is so much emphasis on the global south. I see sitting here before us many students from other parts of the world. The true meaning of Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam. I know that there will be presentations by students from Egypt and Indonesia. And that is because we in India believe that the world is one family. That we are one earth, one family, and that we have a common future. The 7 petals of the G20 logo represent the 7 continents. The 7 musical notes, which when they merge with one another, truly result in music. And that is significant. It symbolizes our oneness as human beings. India speaks for all. As the Prime Minister has said, India speaks for the global south. Just a month and a half ago, the Prime Minister engaged 123 leaders from around the world. Presidents, prime ministers, foreign ministers, leaders of the delegation, to hear their views about the future. In a world which is fractured today, in a world which is greatly challenged. The G20 is also important because it comprises 85% of the global GDP, 75% of global trade, and 2/3 of global population. It is, as Prime Minister Modi has described it, it is meant to be action-oriented, decisive, and ambitious as far as India is concerned. Today, what happens in India has great impact on the world beyond our shores. So also what is happening in the world around us has a major impact on what happens in India. But this G20 event will also be very important in order to showcase our great culture. We are going to organize, and we've already begun to organize, more than 200 events around the country in more than 50 cities across 32 different segments, which really means that we will promote our culture, our cuisine. We will promote tourism. This is a great opportunity for renewal of infrastructure across the country. We will stimulate the local economies by promoting the notion of the concept of one district, one product. In many ways, therefore, it's a great opportunity. It is entirely fortuitous that it happens to be India's presidency at the very start of the Amrit Kal period, which has been described by the Prime Minister of India as this wonderful period between now and 2047, when India celebrates its centenary, India is expected to become a developed country. We have entered that golden period now. It is India that is going to provide the values and the ethics that are today so lacking in international affairs. Around the world, we can see a great shortage of values, a great shortage of ethics. The world does not simply need vaccines for pandemics. The world also needs vaccines for morality, a new moral compass that only a country like India can give with its rich history and culture. The T20, my friends, is the Ideas Bank. It is one of the 11 engagement groups. It is also the Ideas Bank that is required to support the G20. Today, we take on the G20 presidency at a time when India has emerged as a resilient economy in the aftermath of the pandemic, in the aftermath of emerging tensions around the world, contradictions. It is India that is still a resilient economy, growing at 7% and expected to grow at 7% or more for the next decade and a half. As I mentioned before, we have entered that Amrit Kal period in which we must all join our hands, work together in order to realize this objective of making India a developed country. India has also emerged as an independent pole in international affairs. In a fractured world, it is India that has been given this great opportunity to share its civilizational ethos of peace and non-violence. Sarve Jana Sukhino Bhavantu. We believe in the happiness of all mankind. It is an opportunity for India to strike a new trajectory, not only for ourselves, but for the rest of the world. One in which we have a chance to demonstrate our ability through our value system to be a Vishwa Guru, through our focus on healthcare for humankind, to also be a Vishwa Vaidya, not just a Vishwa Guru. We are taking our vaccine Maitri to much deeper levels. And Arogya Maitri is now being spoken of between India and the rest of the world. So India as G20 presidency augurs well for a world which is today in the midst of what we call multiple crises. Multilateralism, as you have seen, is greatly weakened. Multilateral structures such as the United Nations, such as the WHO, such as the WTO, are not functioning as they were expected to. It is a fractured world, but it is not yet fragmented. And therein lies the hope that India's presidency can come in and give that healing touch. On the highway, on the gridlocked highway of international relations, it is India that can provide that respite, that wayside station where people can pull away from the traffic jams to be able to speak to each other in a friendly manner in the same room, to look for solutions. Even low-hanging fruit will do if we can reach that kind of consensus. The G20 is not a binding institution. Its recommendations are not binding. But therein lies that potential for us to discuss things freely, to seek solutions to these great problems that we face today. Virtually every aspect of globalization as we know it today is challenged. Whether it is trade, which is the key fulcrum of globalization today, whether it is technology, which enables societies to lead better lives and to aspire for better futures, whether it is capital, which is in great shortage today, with more than 75 countries facing debt distress, or whether it is global mobility of people. Everywhere globalization has been challenged. There is essentially a great disruption that has taken place, not only on account of the pandemic, but also on account of the war in Ukraine. Not only on account of the war in Ukraine, but also these rising tensions, major power contestation between The West, for instance, on the one hand, and other autocratic, authoritarian regimes on the other hand. And in this, the Indo-Pacific, the region in which we are located today, is very important. It will determine the future of the 21st century. It will be the fulcrum of the new equilibrium that we seek. The Asia-Pacific is a concept that many people refer to, but it is an outdated concept. It is a concept that was more suitable for the second half of the 20th century, when Japan rose from the ashes of the Second World War and found a new lease of life as an economic power by accessing the great markets across the Pacific, in North America, particularly the United States of America, and then followed the Asian tigers such as Korea, such as Taiwan, Hong Kong, Singapore. Eventually even China accessed the same market of the United States of America to grow into the second largest economy in the world. But that was then. In the 21st century, this trend of spreading growth, prosperity and development is no longer located in a certain geography, no longer restricted to East Asia. It has spread to Southeast Asia, it has spread to South Asia, to countries like India and Bangladesh, which have also shown a capacity for high growth rates, but it has also spread all the way to the east coast of Africa. And between these two oceans, the geopolitical and geoeconomic space is interlinked. There is nothing that happens in the Indian Ocean that does not have an effect in the Pacific. And there is nothing that likewise happens in the Pacific Ocean that does not have an impact in the Indian Ocean. Within this, we see that the world today is divided. There is disruption across 6 core factors, which I'd like to describe as the 6 T's. The first is trade, which I mentioned earlier. But trade is fungible. It can recover. It has a momentum and life of its own. We have seen that despite the move towards decoupling by certain economies from certain others, it has been virtually impossible to decouple. India's trade with China has actually grown since 2020. It now stands at $135 billion. And our adverse balance of trade has grown even further. But that is also true of the trade between the United States of America and China. It's also true of trade between Japan and China. The point I'm trying to make is that trade is not easily controlled. Trade is something that happens due to the market forces, demand and supply. The private sector is involved. Entrepreneurs, small and medium enterprises are involved. But the tensions, the friction with regard to the second T, that technology, are real. As the world moves towards big data, towards artificial intelligence, towards new and emerging technologies, the consequences of which are still unpredictable, it is easier to engage in denial regimes through sanctions, through export controls, and that is happening today. The third T is that of territory. There are territorial disputes in the Indo-Pacific that are yet to be reconciled. Why just the Indo-Pacific? For the first time, after nearly 77 years, we see that Europe's security is once again challenged. In the war in Ukraine, there is a question mark about security in Europe. So territorial disputes are the third T. The fourth T is of terrorism. When people speak about geoeconomics, they forget about the need for peace and stability in societies. And terrorism continues to rear its ugly head, including cross-border terrorism, in India's case. The fourth is the T of tenets, narratives, systems of economic, social, cultural development, governance, the clash of narratives about whose system is superior And this is something that we live with today. But this is also a story that's greatly complicated as a result of mass circulation of information, misinformation, disinformation, propaganda. And as a result of all this, there is the sixth T, trust, or the lack of it, which is greatly challenged. And it is India's G20 presidency which will seek to address these frictions in a fragmented world, a fractured world, through its policy of inclusive consultations, through its motto of one earth, one family, one future, and by actually seeking results. Economic recovery, climate change, especially its effect on low-income countries, island countries. These are the great challenges of today. And most developing countries today are being given binary choices, either this or that. Hence, it is under India's G20 presidency that we would seek to offer more choices to the developing world. After all, the G20 is the largest representative grouping in the world. It includes 19 of the largest economies and also one large economic union, the European Union. It has the G7 in it. The developing countries are also represented through groups such as BRICS, for instance, all within the G20. Even the quadrilateral security dialogue members are involved in the G20. Major powers everywhere are suspect today because of the trust factor, the lack of trust. And it is countries like India that can actually work in tandem with other powers like Indonesia, like Brazil, like Australia, like Japan, to offer more choice to developing countries. We can engage with others in what we call bilateral, trilateral, plurilateral structures in order to take this narrative forward. All 20 don't have to agree on everything. Within that room, we can and must find new friends to work together. It is also a very fortunate development that as India takes on its responsibilities as G20 president, Japan is the president of the G7. And between India and Japan, there is a very close and deep friendship, a strategic partnership. And we can together convince the others. Japan can act as a voice with regard to the G7, we can act as a voice with regard to the developing countries to see how we can bring people together. Within the T20, as you are aware, based on the G20's priorities, India's priorities, we have several task forces. The first task force 1, focuses on macroeconomics, on trade, on how to revive trade, how to make trade more transparent, how to bring down tariffs, how to enable exports to grow. And this is something that will also look at supply chains. Supply chains that are today increasingly divided into critical and non-critical supply chains. Supply chains that are subject to a securitized vision. Economics today is being trumped by security considerations for the first time in the history of globalization. And this is an increasing phenomenon. This trend is likely to continue. The second task force looks at a common digital future on which Mr. Anirban Sarma just gave you several ideas. But India's success in JAM, that is Jan Dhan Aadhaar, and the mobile phone applications, India's success in the unified payments interface, UPI, this is something that we can share with the rest of the world. Particularly, we can share it with developing countries through appropriate safeguards, through appropriate capacity building programs. The most important, however, in my view, is the work of Task Force 3, which looks at lifestyle for environment. How many of you in this hall have heard of LIFE? And how many of you know that it is a very important concept that was proposed by none other than the Prime Minister of India, Shri Narendra Modi, at COP26. And it is an idea that is very simple but has very profound implications. And the simple concept here is that if we have to protect our environment and if we have to safeguard, our future, the future of our youth and future generations, each one of us has to act responsibly when it comes to the environment. The idea is to create millions and billions of pro-planet people who through their individual actions will have a very major impact on societies, and societies will have an impact on nations, and nations will have an impact on the global community. And this is to be done with values and ethics, India's great civilizational ethos driving us forward. For all Indians are taught from birth to respect the environment. I recall Prime Minister Modi stating in one of his earlier speeches that many Indians, the first thing they do when they wake up is to bow before Mother Earth and to respect Mother Earth for all its bounties and blessings. Task Force 4 is to look at clean energy and green transition. For if we have to prevent this disastrous global warming, if we have to cap, rise in global temperatures to 1.5 degrees or keep it below 2 degrees, we will have to do something dramatic like move towards clean energy. And India has done this by, announcing the Panchamrit, as you know. Prime Minister Modi announced Panchamrit unilaterally. As a responsible power, India has taken on those responsibilities to move towards 50% generation of our electricity by 2030 coming from clean energy, reducing our carbon emissions, reducing the role of fossil fuels, reducing the whole impact on the environment. And our National Hydrogen Mission, with about 20,000 crores of rupees, that's about $2.4 billion committed to that program, is going to help us move into a better future. Task Force 5 looks at global financial order, review of quota-based special drawing rights. Now you're all aware that the World Bank and the IMF, like the United Nations, are treaty-based organizations. This entire structure, this panoply of the United Nations, the UN Security Council, the World Bank, the IMF, these are structures created at the end of the Second World War for a certain period by the victors of the Second World War. They are not suitable for today's, economy. They are not well suited to provide answers to the challenges that humankind faces today. They require reform, drastic reforms. At the end of the Second World War, the concept was, to the victor go the spoils. The UN Security Council was created in 1945 with 5 permanent members. They have a veto power over everything. It was not nuclear weapons that allowed certain powers to become permanent members of the UN Security Council. In fact, in 1945, there was only one power that had nuclear weapons. That was the United States of America. In fact, countries sought nuclear weapons as a result of the privileged status they had in the UN Security Council as permanent members. To my mind, that is a kind of abuse of a privileged position that they had. We have seen how the League of Nations at the end of the First World War was not successful in keeping peace and stability. You all may have heard of the Treaty of Versailles that was attempted in 1919. It failed. After the Great War, it failed to bring about any permanent structure for peace and stability. In 1920, the League of Nations was formed, but it was not supported by the United States of America. and Japan and Germany were very reluctant participants. Their aims and objectives were not fulfilled by the League of Nations. And the 1930s saw either a walkout by many of these great powers that were militarizing, or they were removed. Japan left in 1933 after moving into Manchuria. Germany left a couple of years later after interfering in the Spanish Civil War. Italy left a year later, around 1936 or 37, after interfering in Abyssinia in Africa. And Russia and the Soviet Union was removed in 1939 after only 5 years of its membership. So we are looking at the possibility of the United Nations and the UN Security Council as it exists today meeting the same fate in the future if we do not reform it. There is no guarantee that it will last this 21st century, for the balance of power has shifted. The balance of power, the engines of global growth are no longer where they were in 1945. This is a new world, a world in which countries like India have emerged as very strong and independent poles. The World Bank and the IMF also require great reform. The IMF loan system is still based on a very outdated quota system of special drawing rights. I am not an economist, and when I tried to understand this concept, it was very bizarre. It said that in 1945 and in subsequent years, the quota system was evolved based on the relative contribution of a country's economy in the global economy. But when you look at the quota system today, you find that a relatively declined Britain, UK, despite contributing only 4.5% to the global economy, still has quota rights that are SDRs that are 6.4%. And India, which contributes 3.25% of the global economy, has SDRs around 2.75%. So there is a great deal of discrimination there. And add to it, in the aftermath of the COVID pandemic, when there are so many countries under debt distress, there is also something called a surcharge being levied by the IMF. Roughly $4 billion have been levied on countries that borrowed from the IMF by way of surcharge. And reforms have come in quite infrequently. In 2008, I recall that the voting rights were increased from, basic voting rights were increased in the IMF from 250 to 750. And there were some further changes made at the 14th review of the SDR and quota system. But this is not adequate to meet the challenges of the 21st century. Task Force 6 deals with SDGs, and of the 17 SDGs, I think the most important one is food security today. As the war in Ukraine has shown us, the shortages of food, fuel, and fertilizer, there are many countries in the world that are unable today to feed their own people. And traditional exporters are no longer able to export because of war and strife. Wheat, for example, from Ukraine and Russia. Countries like India have actually helped, alongside others like Turkey, to broker some of these arrangements that allowed evacuation of wheat from Europe to those parts that need them. And India, as a very large producer of wheat, I think the third largest producer of wheat in the world is India. But India is also the largest producer of millets. 41% of all millets in the world are produced by India. And so it is time for India to actually form an alliance during the G20 presidency of major millet producers, sharing best practices, technology and financing for the production of millets, to popularize millets, to also export millets to those that need them. The last task force, Task Force 7, is about reform multilateralism. reform of the United Nations itself. The last time that the United Nations Security Council was reformed was the only time that it was reformed, and that was in the 1960s. When the UN was formed in 1945, there were only 51 members. And the UN Security Council had 11 members, 5 permanent and 6 non-permanent. The only time this figure changed was in 1965, when the non-permanent category was increased from 6 to 10, bringing the total number to 15. It does not reflect the world that exists today. There are many diminished powers still sitting in the United Nations Security Council. Some sit there because they have thousands of nuclear weapons, not necessarily large economies. So it is time that the world looked at reform of this international system. Ladies and gentlemen, today I think it is extremely fortuitous that India's G20 presidency coincides with its emergence as one of the world's largest economies. India is today the 5th largest economy in the world and set to emerge as among the top 2 or 3 in the not too distant future during the Amrit Kal period. Our Atmanirbhar Bharat policy is not autarkic. It is not meant to take us to some medieval age where we deglobalize. It is very different from an autarkic policy or a closed door policy. Self-reliance that Atmanirbhar Bharat will give us is very different from self-sufficiency. Self-reliance only means that we will equip ourselves to be more competitive, to be better able to engage partners around the world for mutual benefit. We also are driven by our Vedanta teachings. Our outlook is driven by the Vedanta teachings of the Atman as we represent it, the billions of souls that exist, and the Brahman concept of Advaita, where all the Atman come together to merge with the Brahman. The idea here is that we are, at the end of the day, one family and we have one future. Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam. That's a very important concept. It's also the concept that drives India's initiatives like One Sun, One World, One Grid, which is the energy equivalent of that spiritual oneness that we come together. So with these few words, ladies and gentlemen, let me thank you all. Let me once again wish you all the very best. I'm very grateful to you all for acknowledging our presence here and receiving us with such warmth and friendship. It's always good to be back in my alma mater, Gujarat University. Namaskar. Thank you.